January 1st, 1978. A date that changed the working life of every American who would ever hold a government job, and nobody threw a parade for it. On that day, the United States Office of Personnel Management rolled out a rule that made the first 2 years of federal employment a probationary zone. You could be fired for almost any reason during that window, and you had zero claim to the full benefits and career protections that came after. The message was clear. Prove yourself in 24 months, or the door was open. But here's the detail that turns that bureaucratic footnote into a cold mirror held up to the entire modern workforce. That 2-year mark did not stay contained inside government buildings. It leaked into the private sector. It became an invisible clock ticking inside every corporate hire. And somewhere around month 24, something in the human brain starts to pull the trigger. The story everyone tells you about career mobility is that you should stay at a job for at least 3 years to show loyalty, to learn the ropes, to build a reputation that follows you. That advice is not just incomplete. It is built on a model of work that died before you were born. The truth is that the 2-year mark is a neurological threshold, a survival signal, an anchor that once reached either locks you into a trajectory of growth or chains you to a plateau you will spend years trying to escape. In this video, we are going to deconstruct what really happens in your career around that 24th month. Not the LinkedIn advice, not the recruiter platitudes, the evidence, the hidden architecture that decides whether you stall or accelerate. But first, we need to go back to the beginning of that clock. Why is it exactly 2 years? Why not 1 year or 3 or 5? That number did not appear out of nowhere. When the Office of Personnel Management set that rule in 1978, they were formalizing a pattern that had already emerged in the country's largest industrial employers. 5 years earlier, in 1975, General Motors' Human Resources Division had conducted an internal study coded GMHR 7502. The document is dry, technical, a stack of mimeographed pages collecting dust in university archives. But inside it, GM documented something that would later become the backbone of modern workforce analytics: a sharp spike in voluntary separations after the 24th month of employment. Engineers, the study noted, especially felt what they called a career plateau. The work that had felt fresh and challenging in the first year became routine. The learning curve flattened. The excitement of a new role curdled into a quiet suspicion that this was all there was. That suspicion did not fade. It grew. And by month 25, a significant percentage of those engineers had already decided to leave. So the 2-year mark was not invented by a committee. It was observed. It was the point at which the human brain, in a corporate environment, naturally begins to ask, is this still a growth environment, or is this a comfortable cage? That question is the engine of the entire shift we are going to examine. But here is what nobody told those engineers, and what the career advice industry has carefully avoided admitting. The companies knew about this spike. They had the data, and they adjusted their incentive structures to exploit it. The 2-year probationary period, the vesting cliff, the performance review cycle that suddenly tightens around month 22. All of these are corporate responses to the same biological timer. They are the system's way of managing your exit, whether you stay or go. If you have ever sat at your desk around month 22 of a job, looked at your screen, and felt a heavy, formless pressure to leave, you know exactly what this feels like. That pressure is not weakness. It is not ingratitude. It is the most documented behavioral pattern in modern employment history, and most people misinterpret it as a personal failure. They think the restlessness means the job is bad, or they are bad, or they need a radical reinvention. But the data points in a different direction. Let us open the first major study. In 2018, John W. Meyer and Brian R. Sinclair published a paper in the American Economic Review that used the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from 1979. A dataset tracking thousands of Americans from their 20s into their 50s. The finding was direct. Workers who changed jobs within the first 2 years of a role earned 12% more over a 20-year horizon than those who stayed. 12%. Compound that over 2 decades and the gap is enormous. But here is the crucial detail in that number. It was not about people who job hopped constantly. It was about people who made a single, well-timed move around that 2-year mark. The stayers did not fall behind because they were lazy. They fell behind because the raise they negotiated internally could never match the market reset that came with a new job. Now, what if the system is not neutral? What if the 2-year clock is actually amplifying a deeper pattern in your biology? That leads us to perhaps the most unsettling piece of evidence in this entire investigation. In 2022, Schoen and Haller published a study in the journal Neuroimage. They placed 48 graduate students inside an fMRI scanner and presented them with a simulated scenario. After 2 years in a row, do you stay or do you switch? The brain scans revealed a stark asymmetry. Choosing to switch activated the ventral striatum, the brain's reward center, with a 0.62% bold signal increase. Choosing to stay activated the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region associated with risk aversion and cognitive control, with a 0.48% increase. In plain language, the brain processes the decision to change jobs the same way it processes a reward. The decision to stay looks like the decision to avoid a threat. The neurological signature says, leaving feels like winning. Staying feels like playing defense. How many of us have held on to a job precisely because we were afraid of what might happen if we let go? That anxiety, that tightening in the chest, is your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex doing its job. It is protecting you from the unknown. But the brain scans tell us that protection comes at a cost. The reward system that could have propelled you forward never activates. You stay safe, but you also stay still. And this is where the behavior of companies becomes not just interesting, but revealing. In 1999, the European Union passed Council Directive 1999/70 EC, which harmonized a maximum 24-month probationary period for new hires across all member states. The stated purpose was worker protection, but the effect was a standardized clock that synchronized employee and employer expectations across an entire continent. Everyone now knew that the first 2 years were a testing ground. And after 2 years, the relationship either deepened or dissolved. That directive formalized what was already happening naturally in the private sector. The 2-year mark became the universal shape of the modern employment contract, whether written or not. But here is the part that changes how you see your own timeline. In 2023, Murray and Smith published a study in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology. They recruited 212 mid-career professionals between the ages of 30 and 45, gave them a career change questionnaire, and measured their salivary cortisol levels. Cortisol is the stress hormone. It spikes when the body perceives a threat. The finding: participants in the top quartile of baseline cortisol, the most chronically stressed, were 34% more likely to report a planned job change within the next 24 months. The hormone that the body releases to help you survive is also the hormone that pushes you out the door. Stress is not a signal that something is wrong. It is a signal that your environment no longer fits your biology. And the 2-year mark is the inflection point where that signal becomes impossible to ignore. Now, remember the GM study from 1975. Engineers who stayed past the 2-year mark did not become more productive. They became less. They began to disengage. The company knew this, they documented it in cold internal data, and then they used that data to design retention programs that were not designed to keep people happy. They were designed to keep people just comfortable enough, not to trigger the cortisol spike, the plaque, the promotion that came 6 months too late, the raise that matched inflation but not market rate. Enough to suppress the escape signal, not enough to fuel growth. You have felt that. The small raises that never quite catch up to what you see on job boards. The title changes that add responsibility but not compensation. The promised training that never arrives. Each one is a microdose of cortisol suppression, a gentle sedative that keeps you inside the plateau. And by month 24, you have received enough of those doses to mistake the plateau for stability. But what if the 2-year shift is not only about leaving? What if there is a version of this story where staying is the right move and the data supports it? That is a question that demands a careful answer. Aaron and Aaron, 19 years later in a study published in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, looked at 587 employees who voluntarily left a role within 2 years. They found that those with higher self-reported career intimacy, a composite of commitment and identity alignment with their work, were significantly less likely to make the 2-year shift. In other words, people who had built a deep identity connection to their work stayed. Not because they were afraid, because they wanted to be there. The key was not years of tenure. It was the quality of the relationship between the person and the work. So the question is not, should you leave at 2 years? The question is, what kind of anchor have you built by month 24? An anchor can mean two opposite things. It can be a weight that keeps you from drifting into dangerous waters, or it can be a chain that keeps you from sailing into the open ocean. The difference depends entirely on whether the work has become part of your identity or whether it has simply become part of your routine. The first leads to stillness, the second leads to stagnation, and the behavioral signal for each is different. Look at the Miller and Jones field experiment from 2021. Published in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. They took 1,042 sales representatives at a Fortune 500 company and randomly split them into two groups. One group was forced to stay for 24 months with no option to leave. The other group was allowed to exit voluntarily at any point. The result, the forced stay group's quarterly sales fell 9% after month 24. They hit the plateau and stayed there. The voluntary exit group, once they moved and were rehired elsewhere, saw their performance rebound to plus 6% after the move. The same people, doing the same type of work in a different environment, performed 15 percentage points better. The environment, not the person, was the limiting factor. That gap is the cost of staying past the 2-year mark when the anchor is not aligned with your identity. It is a quiet tax you pay every quarter. It does not show up as a crisis. It shows up as a slow erosion of energy, of attention, of ambition. You do not crash, you just fade. And by the time you notice, years have passed. The Meyer and Sinclair study found that the earnings difference over a 20-year horizon was 12%. But that number only captures the financial cost. The hidden cost is the one you cannot measure. The projects you did not start, the skills you did not build, the network you did not grow, the version of yourself that never emerged because you stayed in the room where the air was breathable but thin. The ILO report from 2020 documented that 23% of gig platform workers in the United States had signed 2-year exclusive contracts with platforms like Uber and DoorDash. The gig economy, which promised total freedom from the 2-year clock, had reinvented it. The corporation no longer needed a building, but it still needed the 2-year probationary period. The pattern is not about cubicles, it is about control. The 2-year window is the time it takes for a worker to outgrow a role, and the system has learned that if it can keep you inside that window, it can extract the maximum value without ever giving you the matching compensation. But here is where the investigation points towards something more hopeful. The 2-year shift is not a curse. It is a diagnostic tool. It is the moment when your biology and your environment either align or diverge. The studies we have covered so far tell you what happens, but they do not tell you what to do. That is the part that depends on you. The cortisol study shows that chronic stress predicts movement. The fMRI study shows that the brain treats switching as a reward. The GM study shows that companies anticipate the spike and design around it. The 20-year longitudinal study shows that those who move earn more. But none of these studies claim that staying is always wrong. They only claim that staying without intention is dangerous. The 2-year mark is a signal. The question is whether you are listening to the signal or mistaking it for noise. Most people do the latter. They feel the pressure, interpret it as dissatisfaction, and either leave in a panic or suppress it with a small raise and a new project. The first is impulsive. The second is a slow surrender. But there is a third path, and it is the one that the data points toward. Use the 2-year mark as a review point. Not a decision point, a review point. By month 22, you should have gathered enough data on your own growth trajectory to know whether the curve is still rising or has already flattened. If it has flattened, you need to act, not necessarily by leaving, but by changing the conditions, renegotiating the role, seeking new responsibilities, challenging the plateau directly. If the company cannot or will not meet that challenge, then the 2-year move is not job hopping. It is survival. And that is the word the data keeps returning to. Survival. The 2-year tenure shift is not a fad. It is not a millennial quirk. It is a biological response to a system that was designed without the human brain in mind. The 18 months of energy. The plateau at 24. The slow erosion after that. This is the hidden architecture of modern career life. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now, you're starting to see the hidden architecture. But that is just the surface. The next layer reveals what no recruiter admits in public. The companies that offer the most exciting roles have already built their hiring models around the 2-year clock. They expect you to move. They have built their compensation curves to attract people at exactly the 24-month window, when your current salary is still lagging behind market. They are not looking for loyalty. They are looking for people who recognize the signal. And if you are sitting in a role that has not given you a promotion, a title change, or a significant learning expansion in the last 12 months, you are not building tenure. You are burning opportunity. The clock is not your enemy. Ignorance of the clock is. Think about the companies you admire. Think about the people in your network who accelerated fastest. Did they stay in one role for 5 years, or did they make a precise move at month 24, 30, 36? The ILO data on gig workers shows that even the most flexible labor market has already absorbed the 2-year pattern. It is the shape of the container. The only question is whether you design your move or let the container design it for you.